The first time I saw the name, I assumed it was a cataloging error. University archives are full of them. Old records scanned poorly. Handwritten notes misread by software. Dates shifted by a year or two. You learn not to react emotionally to anomalies. You log them, flag them, and move on. That was my job. I had worked as a senior archivist at the university for nearly 9 years. My work was quiet, methodical, invisible to most people. I didn't teach classes. I didn't publish research. I ensured that records survived intact and that history, at least on paper, remained internally consistent. The name appeared while I was reviewing digitized enrollment records from the early 1980s. A routine verification project funded by a grant that no one remembered applying for. I was checking for duplicate entries when one student file caught my attention. Not because it was incomplete, because it was too complete. Full enrollment history, tuition payments, housing assignments, course grades, faculty evaluations, even disciplinary notes. The student, according to the file, had attended the university for 4 years, graduated with honors, and gone on to complete postgraduate research. Yet I had never heard the name. That alone wasn't unusual. Tens of thousands of students had passed through the institution over the decades. But when I searched the alumni database, there was nothing. No alumni record. No donor profile. No obituary. No employment trace. I checked national registries. Nothing. The student existed only inside the university's records. I marked the file for review and continued working. But the name stayed with me. Something about the consistency of the record felt deliberate. It wasn't patched together. It wasn't sloppy. It had been maintained. The next day, I mentioned it casually to a colleague, expecting him to shrug it off. Instead, he froze. "Don't log that," he said after a pause. "Just don't." I asked why. He didn't answer. He simply returned to his screen and changed the subject. That reaction bothered me more than the anomaly itself. I reopened the file later that afternoon. Nothing had changed. But when I attempted to add a comment, the system denied access. The record was marked read-only. No justification. No audit trail. I had clearance to edit far older, more sensitive documents. This one was locked. I submitted a formal request through internal channels, citing catalog integrity standards. The response came back the same day. Record verified. No action required. That phrase again. I decided to dig deeper, unofficially. I cross-referenced the student's course history with faculty rosters from the same period. Professors listed as instructors existed. Their signatures matched archived handwriting samples. Evaluation comments aligned with departmental style conventions of the era. Everything fit. Too well. I pulled the physical enrollment ledgers from storage, expecting to find inconsistencies between the paper and digital records. The student was there too. Same name, same handwriting style, same annotations. The ink had aged naturally. The papers showed were consistent with handling. If the record was fabricated, it had been fabricated decades ago. I checked housing assignments. Dormitory logs listed the student in a room shared with 2 others. I found their records. Both were real people still alive. I located one of them through a public directory and sent a careful email, framing my question as a historical inquiry. He replied politely, but with confusion. He didn't remember the name. Not vaguely. Not uncertainly. Not at all. I contacted the second roommate. Same response. I sat at my desk long after the archive closed that evening, staring at a name that existed everywhere except in memory. That should have been the end of it. An unresolved anomaly. A footnote. Something to document and move past. But when I logged in the next morning, my own file was flagged. My employment record had been updated overnight. Not altered. Expanded. New annotations had appeared under my profile, referencing committee work I had never done. Internal reviews I had never attended. A mentoring role I did not recognize. The timestamps were old. Some predated my hiring. At first, I assumed my credentials had been merged with someone else's. That happens in large institutions. I filed a correction request. It was closed within an hour. Record accurate. No revision necessary. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with recognition. I searched the system for the mysterious student again. This time, the name appeared linked to me. Not as a colleague, not as a contact, but as a reference. The archive had quietly decided that our histories intersected, and I had no idea how long that intersection had been there. After I noticed the connection between my file and the student record, I stopped treating the situation as an isolated archival anomaly. What had initially felt like a strange coincidence now appeared as a developing pattern, one that involved not just historical data, but active systems that were still making decisions in the present. I began by reviewing access logs. Archivists rarely need to do this, but I had the clearance, and I wanted to understand who had interacted with the student's record over the years. The result was unexpected. There were no spikes, no unusual activity. The file hadn't been accessed irregularly at all. It had been opened, referenced, and verified at steady intervals for decades. Someone had been maintaining it. Not recently, continuously. I checked the verification notes attached to the record. Each audit cycle included a brief confirmation statement, signed digitally by different administrative offices over time. Admissions, housing, academic affairs, compliance. The language evolved, but the outcome never changed. Record verified. Data consistent. No discrepancies found. It was as if the system itself expected the student to exist and was simply reaffirming that expectation every few years. I tried to trace the origin of the file. The earliest digital entry referenced a microfilm scan. The microfilm referenced a physical ledger. The ledger referenced an admissions form. The admissions form referenced a high school transcript. That transcript existed. I requested a copy from the Regional Education Archive listed on the document. The archivist there was helpful and curious. She pulled the file and confirmed its authenticity. Same name, same date of birth, same signature. But when I asked whether there were any graduation records associated with it, she hesitated. There should be, she said, but there aren't. The student had completed secondary education on paper and then vanished from all external systems except ours. That contradiction unsettled me more than anything else. It meant the university wasn't the origin of the record. It was the last place it survived intact. I returned to my own profile and began comparing timelines. That was when I noticed the overlap. Several of the internal committees listed under my name corresponded to years when the student record had been revalidated. My presence in the system aligned with the student's continued existence. I wasn't just connected. I was reinforcing it. I brought the issue to my supervisor, carefully, without speculation. I framed it as a data integrity concern involving legacy records and cross-referenced metadata. She listened politely, nodding in all the right places, then said something that surprised me. That record has always been sensitive, she said. It's been reviewed. By whom? I asked. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. By the appropriate offices. When I pressed for clarification, the meeting ended. Later that day, my access permissions changed again. Not revoked. Narrowed. I could still perform my core duties, but certain historical collections were no longer visible. Search results returned fewer matches. Cross-database queries failed silently. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. I did. I began documenting everything outside the system. Notes, screenshots, physical copies. I wasn't planning to publish anything. I just needed a reference point that didn't move when I looked away. That night, I received an automated notification stating that my employment profile had been harmonized. No explanation. The next morning, a colleague congratulated me on my expanded role. He mentioned a committee I had never heard of, let alone joined. When I corrected him, he looked confused. It's in the directory, he said. I assumed you knew. I checked. The entry was there. At that point, the student record changed again. A new annotation appeared, referencing a faculty advisor. Me. The timestamp was decades old. I stared at the screen, feeling a slow, creeping realization settle in. The system wasn't creating something new. It was redistributing existing data, reassigning relationships until everything appeared internally consistent. The student needed an advisor. The system had one. I considered escalating the issue outside the university, but I hesitated. Academic records are sensitive. Allegations of falsification require proof, not intuition. And every piece of proof I examined existed entirely within the same systems I was beginning to distrust. I reached out to one of the professors listed in the student's file, someone who was still alive. I framed the inquiry carefully as a historical clarification. He responded days later. "I don't recall the student," he wrote, "but the evaluation looks like something I would have written." That was the pattern again. Not memory, compatibility. The system didn't require confirmation. It required plausibility. By the end of the week, my name appeared in more places. Project approvals, archive reviews, historical corrections. Each entry reinforced the same quiet narrative. I had always been involved. My past was being edited retroactively, not to change who I was, but to make me fit something that already existed. I realized then that the student wasn't the anomaly. I was, or rather, I had been, and the system was correcting that inconsistency in the only way it knew how, by rewriting me into its own version of history. Once I accepted that the archive was not simply storing history, but actively maintaining it, the situation became easier to map and harder to escape. Archives are often imagined as passive spaces, repositories where documents rest unchanged. In reality, they are living systems. Records are revalidated, migrated, reconciled, and harmonized as technology changes. Each transition introduces small decisions that compound over time. The student record was not protected by secrecy. It was protected by normality. Every review cycle treated it as expected. Each audit confirmed what the previous one had assumed. Over decades, assumption hardened into fact. At that point, the question of whether the student had ever existed became irrelevant. The record existed. That was enough. What unsettled me most was how little intention was required for this to happen. No one needed to fabricate the file in a single moment. No one needed to remember doing so. The system did the work incrementally, preserving consistency rather than truth. My role within that process now made sense. Archivists are trusted precisely because we do not create content. We preserve it. That trust is quiet and powerful. When an archivist's name appears as a verifier, the record gains legitimacy without scrutiny. The archive didn't need me to invent anything. It needed me to be present. Human identifiers serve as anchors in automated environments. A name implies oversight. A signature implies judgment. Once attached, those markers persist through migrations, upgrades, and reorganizations. They outlive the people who applied them. I reviewed the metadata standards used by the university over the last 50 years. Each revision aimed to improve accuracy, but each also prioritized backward compatibility. Old fields were mapped onto new schemas. Ambiguities were resolved by matching patterns. If two records were sufficiently similar, they were merged. If a relationship was plausible, it was retained. This is how errors survive, not as mistakes, but as features. The student record had accumulated relationships over time because the system expected them. Dorm assignments implied roommates. Courses implied advisors. Graduation implied committee oversight. When those links were missing, the system filled the gaps using the nearest compatible data. That data was me. I realized then that my resistance had actually accelerated the process. Each correction request triggered reconciliation routines. Each inquiry invited the system to explain itself. An explanation, in automated terms, meant alignment. The archive was not malicious. It was adaptive. I thought about the people whose memories conflicted with the records. Former roommates, professors, administrators. Their uncertainty was not evidence against the record. It was noise. Memory fades. Paper persists. Digital systems persist even longer. When faced with a choice between fallible human recollection and internally consistent documentation, institutions choose documentation every time. That choice is rational. It is also dangerous. Once a record reaches a certain threshold of integration, removing it becomes riskier than keeping it. Too many dependencies form around it. Too many secondary references rely on its presence. Deleting it would create visible gaps. Keeping it preserves continuity. Continuity, I had learned, is the highest value. I began to understand that there was no single authority to appeal to. Each department touched the record only lightly. No one owned it. Responsibility had been diffused so effectively that it no longer existed in a meaningful way. The system did not care whether the student was real. It cared whether the archive remained stable. That stability now depended on me. Not because I was important as a person, but because my identity fit. My employment timeline aligned with verification cycles. My role justified annotations. My presence made the record appear reviewed rather than assumed. I was no longer correcting history. I was being used to defend it. The final realization was quiet and deeply unsettling. I could stop engaging. I could request reassignment. I could even leave the university. But the record would remain, and my name, already embedded, would continue to serve its purpose. Archives do not forget. They do not doubt. They remember what they are told to remember. And once something is remembered long enough, it becomes indistinguishable from the truth. I still go to work every morning. I badge in, greet colleagues, review requests, and process records the way I always have. From the outside, nothing about my routine suggests that anything unusual ever happened. The archive functions. The university functions. History, as far as anyone else is concerned, remains intact. What changed was not the work. It was my relationship to it. After I stopped submitting correction requests, the system settled. My access stabilized. My profile stopped updating unexpectedly. The student record remained exactly as it was, neither expanding nor disappearing. It had reached equilibrium. That equilibrium included me. My name appears now in places I don't actively think about anymore. Verification trails, review notes, legacy annotations carried forward during data migrations. Each reference reinforces the same quiet narrative. I was there. I saw it. I approved it. No one has ever asked me directly whether that's true. When people outside the archive ask what I do, I still describe my job the same way. I preserve records. I ensure continuity. Those words haven't changed, but their meaning has. I understand now that preservation is not neutral. To preserve something is to choose it over everything that contradicts it. The student's file has never been questioned again. It passes every automated check. It aligns perfectly with institutional expectations. Any attempt to remove it would require explaining why it had been allowed to exist for so long. No one wants to be responsible for that explanation. Responsibility, I've learned, is the one thing systems avoid more carefully than error. Occasionally, I imagine what it would look like to force the issue, to publish the inconsistency, to gather statements, to build a case that proves the student never existed. But proof requires authority, and authority in this context comes from the very records I would be challenging. It's a closed loop. The archive does not respond to intent. It responds to structure. As long as the structure remains intact, the truth becomes a secondary concern, something academic rather than operational. I've stopped contacting former roommates and professors. Their memories don't help. They fade, conflict, and contradict one another. The record never does. Faced with that contrast, institutions always choose the version that doesn't change. Paper is patient. Digital systems are even more so. Over time, I began to notice how often similar patterns appeared elsewhere. Minor discrepancies resolved quietly. Annotations added to smooth transitions. Gaps filled with assumptions rather than questions. None of it dramatic. None of it malicious. Just countless small decisions made in favor of continuity. That's how false histories survive. Not because someone insists on them, but because correcting them would require more effort than maintaining them. I no longer think of the student as a person. I think of the record as a function. It exists to satisfy the archive's need for internal consistency. Whether anyone ever lived that life is no longer relevant to the system that remembers it. And the archive does remember. It remembers steadily, without emotion, without doubt. Each migration reinforces the same data. Each audit confirms the same conclusions. Each passing year makes the record harder to question. I used to believe that archives were guardians of truth. Now I understand they are guardians of coherence. Truth only survives when it aligns neatly with the structures designed to protect it. Mine didn't. My memory of events diverges from the record in ways that no longer matter to anyone but me. And because memory cannot be indexed or verified, it carries no institutional weight. The system does not care what I remember. It cares what I confirm. I have considered leaving the university more than once. But departure wouldn't change anything. The annotations would remain. The student would still exist. My name would still be attached to the record long after I was gone. Archives outlive archivists. That realization stripped the situation of its urgency. There is nothing left to expose. Nothing left to correct. The process has completed itself. The student is real now in the only way that matters. Documented, verified, preserved. And I am part of that preservation whether I like it or not. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the archive is quiet and the building is nearly empty, I think about how history will be read decades from now. How future researchers will trace timelines, verify sources, and trust the records placed in front of them. They will see a student who attended the university, completed their work, and moved on. They will see an archivist who verified the record. They will not see doubt. They will not see hesitation. They will not see the moment when memory and documentation diverged, because that moment was never recorded. And anything that isn't recorded eventually disappears. That is the final truth the archive taught me. Not everything that happens survives. Only what is preserved long enough to stop being questioned. And once that happens, the difference between truth and record no longer matters. The archive will continue to remember, even if what it remembers was never real.